Welcome to this explainer. Today we are unpacking a real heavyweight in Philippine jurisprudence, Victoria's Planters Association versus Victoria's Milling Company. It's a fascinating story of a long-standing business relationship, the sudden catastrophic disruption of World War II, and a super high-stakes legal battle over time itself. Before we dive right into the facts, I kind of want to ground us in the fundamental study of obligations and contracts under the Philippine Civil Code, because that is exactly where this whole dispute lives. The law on obligations and contracts, or oblicon, as law students affectionately call it, is literally the bedrock for how agreements are enforced. We're going to see these dry textbook principles leap right off the page and into a real-world scenario where millions of pesos and decades of labor were on the line. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. Title and legal doctrine, 2. Syllabus and case summary, 3. Facts of the dispute, 4. The central legal issue, 5. The Supreme Court ruling, and 6. Impact on contract law. All right, let's start right at the top. Part 1. Title and legal doctrine. The absolute crux of this case hinges on the concept of a fortuitous event, or force majeure. Basically, this is an unexpected event, think a war, a massive typhoon, or a devastating earthquake, that relieves an obligor from fulfilling a contractual duty while that event is actually happening. I mean, if you literally cannot perform your duty because of an act of God or the outbreak of a global war, the law doesn't punish you for that failure. Makes sense, right? Well, here is the catch. We have to balance that temporary suspension with Article 1159 of the Civil Code, which strictly dictates that a valid contract is the absolute law between the parties. Once you sign it, you're bound to it. It has the force of law, and neither party can just back out without mutual consent. So the main tension in our explainer today is this. What happens to the strict force of law of a contract when a fortuitous event makes it physically impossible to comply for a long period of time? Let's jump to Part 2, Syllabus and Case Summary. To give you a quick spoiler on the court's ultimate ruling, a 30-year sugarcane milling contract interrupted by World War II cannot be extended by the 6 lost years of war and reconstruction. Period. Basically, a fortuitous event relieves parties from their obligations during the disruption, but it absolutely does not pause the actual expiration clock of the contract itself. It doesn't just automatically tack on extra years to the end of the agreement.
Okay, Part 3, Facts of the Dispute. Let's see how this all went down.
Picture this timeline. Between 1917 and 1934, sugarcane planters signed these standard 30-year milling contracts with the Central, which eventually became Victoria's Milling Company. The first millings kicked off around 1918 to 1922, and honestly, everything was running smoothly for decades. But then, from 1941 to 1947, World War II broke out and the Japanese occupied the Philippines. Producing sugar actually became contrary to public policy because it aided the enemy's war machine. The mill was destroyed, and for 4 years of war plus 2 years of post-war reconstruction, so 6 years in total, literally no milling happened. Fast forward to 1948. The planters realize, hey, 30 years have passed since the contract started, so they declare the contract's expired. But the milling company, they flat out refused to accept that. So the crucial point of tension is right here. The planners are arguing that 30 years means 30 agricultural calendar years. The time passed, the clock ran out, therefore the contract is over and they're free to negotiate better, more modern terms. But the milling company argued, wait, the contract actually meant 30 times milling years. Because the war and reconstruction stopped the milling for 6 whole years, they argue that, in fairness and equity, those 6 lost years should be added on to the end of the contract. They wanted the planners bound for another 6 years to make up for the shortfall. And that brings us to Part 4, the central legal issue. The justices had to answer a really tricky question. Does a fortuitous event, like World War II, that suspends performance also stop the running of the agreed 30-year contract term, thereby extending it? In other words, does physical impossibility to perform an obligation effectively hit the pause button on a contract's expiration date? Let's see how they resolved this in Part 5, the Supreme Court ruling. The court systematically dismantled the milling company's argument piece by piece. First, they noted that the phrase first milling in the contract was simply a starting point to start counting the 30 years. It didn't mean they were strictly counting milling years. Second, and this is a massive oblicon takeaway, a fortuitous event relieves parties from fulfilling their obligations during the time of the event, but it doesn't mean the event stops the calendar from running on the agreed period. The court pointed out that forcing the planters to deliver sugarcane for an extra 6 years would effectively be creating a brand new extension to the term of the contract. And you just can't do that without mutual consent, which the planters were obviously not giving. The court anchored its reasoning in this incredibly powerful legal maxim, nemo tenatur et impossibilia. It literally means no one is bound to do the impossible. The court explained that because it was physically and legally impossible for the planters to deliver cane during the occupation and impossible for the central to mill it while they were rebuilding, the milling company cannot later demand that those lost years be made up. You just cannot demand the performance of an obligation that was impossible when it was due. The law simply writes those unperformed obligations off. So, the final verdict? The court decisively affirmed the lower court's ruling. The 30-year period expired exactly on the 30th agricultural year. There was no 6-year extension granted to the milling company. The planters were officially free from the old contracts. Finally, let's wrap this up by looking at the big picture in Part 6, Impact on Contract Law. This ruling is a huge deal for law students because it provides a crystal clear 3-step framework for handling contracts that get derailed by massive unforeseen disasters. Step 1, identify the fortuitous event causing the physical impossibility. Step 2, suspend the specific obligations for both parties during that event. Step 3, do not alter the contract's agreed expiration date unless both parties agree to an extension. It's brilliant because it ensures neither party is unfairly punished for an act of God, but also ensures neither is trapped beyond their original intent. It completely preserves the integrity of the contract's timeline. I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. If a contract is truly the law between parties, how much should equity and fairness matter when global catastrophes make fulfilling that law impossible? The Victoria's case shows us exactly where human impossibility draws the hard line against the rigidity of contract law. It proves that while agreements are binding, the law does not and cannot require us to achieve the impossible. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep exploring how these incredible obligation principles intersect with real human history.